I'd like to welcome you to this DSA organised webinar to take stock of the UK's new international development strategy, which finally arrived after a prolonged series of delays early last week. And to find out if it was all worth the wait, we have an excellent panel lined up to discuss this with you. We have Stefan Dercon, Professor of Economics at the Bavanac School of Economic Policy at Oxford University, and until very recently, a Senior Advisor for FCDO. Melissa Leach, Director of the Institute of Development Studies. Mark Miller, Director of Programme for ODI's Development and Public Finance Programme, ODI being the Overseas Development Institute in London. And Karimi, Director of Policy, Public Affairs and Campaigns at Christian Aid. So we're looking forward to getting their perspectives on the new IDS. My name's Sam Hickey. I'm a Professor of Politics and Development at the University of Manchester and the President of the Development Studies Association. And my co-chair today is Annalisa Prison, a DSA Council member and also of ODI, who will be fielding your questions via the Q&A function. So just so we've got a starting point, a couple of things about the new international development strategy. As many of you will have read, it sets out four main priorities around trade and investment, around women and girls, humanitarian assistance, and a bit of a bucket of global issues around health and climate change in particular. It tries to grapple with the new geopolitical context that we find ourselves in and the role of the UK within that at several points, and sends a strong signal that aid will be used in pursuit of a wide range of other agendas joined up with the whole of government approach and a number of different directions for how not just aid but development will be delivered in terms of modalities and where decision-making powers will rest. And strongly reflects a more individualistic approach to the UK's role in the world in terms of a shift from multilateral to bilateral modes of cooperation. So in the time we have together, what we're going to do is to focus on, firstly, on the what's being put on the table by this IDS, how does it represent a good alignment between UK's potential contribution and the development challenges of the day. Then we'll move on to the how. How is this being proposed to be delivered and does this make sense? And because with the DSA, we will close on discussion of what this means for research and the production of evidence and knowledge in pursuit of development and social justice. And after each round, each panelist will have a contribution and then we'll go to the floor for questions and answers. Please do use the Q&A function, not the chat function, just the Q&A function, please, and we'll field the questions there for you. So the webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand on the DSA website shortly after the event closes, but attendees will not be recorded other than the panelists. So as I said, please type your questions for the speakers in the Q&A function. And just to let you know, it's in case you're feeling alienated out there in the world of Zoom webinar, we have nearly 80 participants and climbing in the room, so you're in very good company. And I think that's it for the housekeeping. So let's get started. So the first part of the session will be on the what. So Stefan, can you please kick us off? Can you place the international development strategy in context and talk a little bit about whether this represents a major departure from what how DFID used to think about development, and whether it's coherent? Does this align with the best of what we've got with the current development challenges of the day?
Well, thank you very much, Sam. And well, let me start actually maybe outlining in terms of how I think the DFID approach to something like this would have been, to kind of how would it strategically put itself forward. And I think DFID over definitely the years I was involved, but also from before, I was involved from 2011, but also before, it had a kind of an internationalist view. Basically it would start from global challenges and it asked itself, how does it fit in these global challenges, how can the UK respond? You know, and often a criticism may have been, say, it wants to do everything, but, you know, we ended up probably doing everything. We would have looked at all the kind of crisis point, the big challenges. There would have been some talk about, you know, what are all these development challenges of the time, and actually kind of respond to that. At many levels, this is not what the strategy, the way it seems to have evolved and the way it presents itself. There's a bit behind that, but it's probably not like that. And I think there's probably three ways in which this document is quite a departure from, start from challenges and then see what is the development answer. But I will immediately qualify it. In practice, maybe the differences are not that big, but definitely framing the differences are substantial. So there's 3 points there, and then I'll comment on a few of the choices that are being made as well. So 3 general points, and then four brief points on some of the framing there as well, on the details as well. So the first one is that this is a very much a political document. Of course, every white paper and so on obviously is a political document, but it's probably more political than you probably have been used to in the development space. Okay, so it starts essentially from a perception of what is our national interest, what is our foreign policy objectives. And of course, that was in the way how it was commissioned from number 10. The integrated review presented itself. We need to have a say on how will the international development strategy build on it. So it becomes already a kind of a pick and choosing of global challenges and see where we do fit in. So it starts from national interest, from a foreign policy interest. How could we then pick up certain things in it? You know, where will we then pay attention in the global space? Probably a second point then is that, and let me just be honest and, you know, a little bit in the way the kitchen, how it was all cooked in the kitchen, is that this went to a huge amount of versions, okay? Some of the essential points in terms of how and what may have been present in versions in July. I don't know how many versions the team went through, but I think it's probably 31 or something. So, and not for nothing, it kept on being delayed because also the world kept on moving on. So, and actually geopolitics became an increasingly strong part of it. And of course, over this period between, say, July and now, geopolitics became, rather than a salient feature, say, think of China, to actually be a very upfront feature to do with what was happening in the world. But you should understand it then. It becomes, you know, probably where in the strongest language, it's the geopolitical language that comes through now. So it comes from the national interest. And it's now a much more geopolitical language. Now, DFID would never have done that. It would never have been its role, its place to do that in a kind of strategic thing. Of course, it tells us a bit about how the institution potentially is changing as well. And, you know, some people in the political space would say that's not true. That's what it should be. Maybe some of us in the development space are saying that's with regret that we see this happening. Because we, first of all, know that geopolitics tends to be not very good for development. It puts development part in a kind of geopolitical battle. And I kind of remember the 1980s, and some of us on the call will do. That wasn't necessarily the best time for development because it gets mixed up with Cold War and all the kind of things. So there is something there that it is quite different. It becomes now a resolute part of geopolitics, of the political positioning within geopolitics. But of course, I would at the same time say is that as long as DFID existed, is say between, and especially say between 2000 and say 2015-16, we were living in a remarkable world where geopolitics wasn't a big factor. So I think if the US were to write a development strategy, it may look more like this one as well, or even Australia and so on. So we should not say, oh, this is regret that we do this. It's actually a tendency in the global world that development will look different. And maybe we should just clock that as well. But still, that's my second point. First one, it's a political document. Second, it's a geopolitical document. And then third one, I would actually say, you know, in every organization where you have to write a strategy, you have to be conscious about your constraints. And one of the big constraints is a lot to be with the nature of resource, the extent of resource, and what is there. And in fact, why these priorities are what they are not like, let's start with a blank sheet of paper and let's now do these things. why the document has this emphasis on the humanitarian, the point on capital, on the climate change, and then on women and girls in education, definitely 3 out of 4 were kind of locked in choices that because of things to do with COP, climate change, it was politically virtually impossible to reduce the ICF despite the cuts, the International Climate Fund. So you're locked in with that. The humanitarian, all the salient features of Afghanistan and other conflicts, it would be very hard to actually not make that a priority. And arguably, the population, that's one of the few things in development that the general population tends to support. Then furthermore, the whole thing about investment and so on, I'm sure it's from the Foreign Secretary not a resolute choice, but it definitely has helped that the Treasury, as Mark Miller has nicely also clarified on Twitter and in some contributions, actually there's an awful lot of capital now that you couldn't spend on education or on health or humanitarian. So you need to do it with more an investment type of portfolio. And so you end up with your resource locked into that. And the education, that's clearly, it's kind of a prime ministerial choice that we also wear with, and that becomes then the thing. And then global health is still there, what can you do after COVID? So kind of the way you're locked in and the kind of the saliencies of narratives get some of these priorities. Actually, it's the first 2 that are much more striking things. So very quickly, to finish in opening comments, there's a lot of talk about, the offer will be looking very different from the past. Talking about world-class British expertise. Well, ultimately we had that evolution in the past already. This focus on selling Britain and doing it. This is just a continuation of the 2015 strategy on doing it. Talking about stripping back executive bureaucracy and delivering aid. Look, anyone who gets any money from FCDO would probably welcome that. It's a lot to do with the accountability things as well, but just think also of the political narratives of the day in the UK as well. The patient approach, actually, that's probably where it's a little bit different, where there is a little bit more space not to be narrowly focused on results in the short run and doing more. So that may look a little bit different. I don't know in practice how much. And then finally, we'll talk more about on the country and bilateral programming stuff. Of course, that has something to do with, in a more political world, you may want to take back control also a little bit more of how it's spent, where multilaterals is actually very hard to do, and maybe it fits in with that geopolitical vision. I'm sure we'll talk more about the multilateralism or not, although I will want to just make a small point. If we go back to the percentages spent through multilaterals, it won't be looking that different from the latter days of the new Labour government. So actually, this is a little bit more something that had increased quite dramatically with the 0.7 that actually is probably bringing back to earlier levels. I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
I think we may have missed your very last point there, Stefan, in terms of what you were just highlighting a change between what the last New Labour government may have done and linking it to the change of ODA levels.
Okay, sorry, I wanted to say this is about the share of spending on multilaterals, where a lot is made in language about it. And of course, it fits into a geopolitical language where multilaterals, everybody comes together and everybody sits there. We can talk about perceived changes in power relationships in the UN and so on, but actually it's maybe not as dramatic as it is presented. If we go in share of spending, we may be back closer to where maybe New Labour was towards the end before the uplift 2.7. And that's actually, we should not overstate this as a kind of a departure from it, but it's of course language related to the politics as well.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, thanks. We'll come a little bit more onto those issues of the how, of what routes the UK will try and mobilise this new strategy. But coming back to the what, Melissa, what's your impression of this? Does it make sense as a response to the current global challenges and to what the UK can best contribute to those?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Sam. I mean, as we've just heard from Stefan, this isn't really a response to global challenges. This strategy is a highly political document. And while reading it in those terms, I still think we have to ask some very hard questions. about the extent to which it is really responding to our challenges, and indeed to development, which in legal terms needs to be about improving the lives of the poorest, and in very broad terms, development is about good change. So does this make sense as a development strategy? And there, I think, while there are some good bits in it, it is actually wanting in several respects. So first off, I think we're very aware that this is a moment, this is a time when we're seeing a whole range of interconnected global challenges. War, conflict, climate change, the aftermath of COVID, economic challenges, rising inequalities of many kinds. And many of these are actually leading to development in reverse, one might say. And that's the challenge really that the new strategy had to rise to. And one of the points, of course, is that because these challenges are interconnected and the processes underlying them are interconnected, picking off priorities in isolation is not going to go all the way. You need a bit more of a rounded response, not a kind of hand-picking of priorities, both normatively and pragmatically. They're not likely to be as effective as they might be. For instance, you can't really improve the lives of women and girls without addressing the harm that's being caused to them by climate and environmental change, by religious persecution, by poor health, by conflict, which are going to be playing out in different connected ways in different parts of the world. I think what we had with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which interestingly get one mention in this strategy, was actually a framework for addressing a package of priorities together. And I think we're not seeing a strategy there that's going to help on those, and indeed reversals on many previous achievements. Those at risk of being left behind by the SDGs are now perhaps more at risk of being left behind. They're facing greater precarities and vulnerabilities. And I don't think this strategy is offering very much to help that situation. I think we've also got a bit of an issue in this focus on trade and investments, which there's been a lot of coverage in the press suggesting that this is a return to tied aid. There's also been a rebuttal of that. But whether or not it is legally tied aid, it's certainly lightly tied aid. And I think in some circumstances we're seeing the main emphasis of programs and potential investments being around investment and trade and benefit to the UK and UK companies, with the poverty reduction and development benefits being seen as secondary. I think that's actually pretty much the wrong way round. Aid needs primarily to be invested in supporting the poorest people wherever they are, and that support can't be narrowed to countries or indeed programs or groups or issues believed to represent the biggest business or trade opportunities. And then my sort of final point is that the strategy very much emphasizes short-term, quick win and often technical solutions. And there might be places for those in some areas. This is certainly where the health and climate change emphasis in this document, in that large bucket, is. And it might be quite expedient for government to emphasize those. Clearly, there are going to be technical opportunities in some areas, vaccines and drugs and diagnostics, or energy solutions to climate change. But they're not enough for two reasons. First of all, it's overlooking the deeper causes of these problems themselves and of the vulnerabilities that underlie them. And secondly, I think we've learned over painstakingly many years that if you just focus on the technical and technologies, you're actually missing the social and political and economic contexts and circumstances, which are going to affect whether those technical investments actually work, whether they make a difference, and who they make a difference to. So I think without some more attention to those longer term forms of development, forms of action that can tackle causes, generate lasting improvement to people's lives, which involves investments in things like institutions, partnerships, capacities, capabilities, systems, we're not going to end up with a long-term sustainable form of development and way of tackling even the challenges that appear on the surface to be technical, when actually, of course, they're far more than that. So I'll stop there. There's much more one could say about the how, but I think we can pick some of those things up.
Great, thanks very much, Melissa. I mean, one question, slightly back to yourself and Stefan on this, in terms of the apparent contradiction between looking at quick wins and this language of being patient. There does seem to be perhaps a shift away from a narrow focus on growth to a somewhat broader focus on economic development, perhaps, in terms of where the investment should be landing, obviously only if they use British investments and firms and so on. But is that something positive, that there's a wider economic view of what development looks like that might be tied to the ambitions of structural transformation of many leaders in the global south at the moment, around green transitions and so on the growth fronts? Is there something, just to play devil's advocate, something positive there?
So I'm tempted to say, look, there is an opening. I mean, we'll have to see how it all, how it's actually used, but there is definitely an opening there. You know, there is definitely was a commitment and you know, from the internal kitchen, a commitment at the top level as well as in the organization to not just to focus on quick wins. I know in the document there's maybe presentationally a gratuitous focus on nice to explain in a box technical solutions, but actually one of the things, and of course that has changed within FCDO because of the way Treasury has been providing so much more capital, you know, you need to have more patience then. This has to be long term. You know, if you're going to have to spend capital in these places, it's not self-evident. You may have to do partnerships with governments. It's not about just some quick deal here. It is actually longer term stuff. And so this is where probably the language of patient approach has maybe a bit of a patient capital allusion to it that hopefully people had noticed, to actually say, and it is language about, you know, economic and social foundations. The hard thing is that, you know, when you end up delivering, and at the same occurred always in DFID as well, sometimes the immediate pressures of quick results and so on are often there. But I think there is a commitment still amongst the organization to actually use that capital and the fact that there is that capital to have something that's actually more a genuine offer. Of course, if I may quickly do, it has a geopolitical connotation as well. This is arguably what China and so on has been doing. And we had very few offers on that. It won't be the UK alone. Everybody in the organization, I'm sure, is conscious of that. It will have to be other countries as well. But at least there's a realization that is what countries want. They want actually to be able to get work on some longer term investments and so on, rather than just some quick 1 year technical assistance by Deloitte or something. They want also that some of that longer term relationship. And there is a window there. Let's see. This is whether it can be delivered.
No, I would agree with that, and we'll have to see how it pans out. I mean, plenty of opportunities to do work around inclusive economies, around collaborative economies, circular economies. I would reinforce the point which I think Stefan suggested is there in some of the thinking, that you can't just do economic development without thinking about the institutions and the politics and the social arrangements that go along with economies. But I mean, I think we would like to see, I mean, I think the truth will be in how this plays out in practice. But certainly there wasn't very much in the document. I mean, maybe it was a little bit of a missed opportunity to make some of those points about the styles and the directions of economic development, which are going ahead. And it's a space to watch.
Thanks both on that. For those of you who've joined us recently, we're in the first round of discussion around the what of the International Development Strategy. And after one more intervention, we'll be pausing for Q&A. So do lodge your questions in the Q&A box. We're up to about 100 participants now. So hopefully there's some good challenging questions out there. So do keep them coming. So we talked a little bit about the economic perspective of it. Karimi, can you give us a sense of what this looks like from a pro-poor and rights-based perspective? There's a lot here on women and girls, and it touches on trade and climate change, areas that you've been working on. Can you give us a sense of what the IDS looks like from a pro-poor and rights-based perspective?
Thank you. Indeed, what both Stefan and Melissa have mentioned is important. So from a propoor and rights perspective, clearly we have major global crises: climate, conflict, effects of COVID, hunger, ongoing extreme poverty and inequality. We would have hoped that the international development strategy coming from the UK, which is the 6th richest country in the world, and a country that has clearly played a significant role in driving global poverty or solutions to global poverty and inequality, but also a country, and we will be nostalgic about, for example, DFID, a strong record of quality aid spending under DFID. So we'd have expected more ambitious proposals that are fit for the crises that we face today. We'd also have hoped that at a minimum, there would be conversation around poverty eradication, because that is what a development strategy should be about or for. So as it stands, our first impression of the strategy is that it offers very scant hope to the increasing number of people across the globe facing conflict, hunger, the impact of the climate crisis, the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. So there is talk, but not enough detail, and not even a budget that has been spelt out. We hope that that will follow, and we look forward to hearing more about that. So when we look at the international development strategy, there are a lot of areas where we can say it sounds good if, or it sounds good but, meaning that there is too little detail or too thin detail for us to draw conclusions at this point. So to go back to the example of women and girls, for example, it's good to see that as a key priority area, including on education and empowerment and ending violence. But tackling gender inequalities and supporting the rights of girls and women doesn't just happen in isolated initiatives to build women and girls' capacities. It needs clear policies and support for tackling the underlying causes and interlocking structural problems that exacerbate gender inequalities, for example. If we look at climate resilience, the strategy is a welcome reiteration of the existing pledge to double, and here I'm quoting, to double our international climate finance. Of course, this is government contribution to at least 11.6 billion pounds between 2021 and 2026, and to maintain a balance between mitigation and adaptation funding. We know that support for climate adaptation is critical to building resilience to climate change for communities across the globe already suffering the worst impacts of climate change. So the language of the strategy of preventing and anticipating future shocks and building resilience in long-running crises by tackling the underlying drivers of crisis, instability and extreme food insecurity, sounds positive. We would agree with that. But what underpins that? All right, so the actual proposals in the document are vague and in some cases actually worrying. For example, there is no reference to the importance of locally led approaches that we know work best for building resilience to climate-related and other humanitarian shocks, and which in the long run are more cost-effective than a cycle of crisis response. We would also, for example, be concerned about the over-reliance on insurance to address climate risk, when we know that insurance can only ever cover a part of the solution, right? And it covers and rarely covers more than 10% of humanitarian and recovery needs. So it's not a substitute for effective community-led action and resilience building. And of course, there's a big focus in the document on private finance, and I'm sure in this conversation we can come back to that. So overall, in our analysis, the strategy places a much greater prioritization on promoting the UK's commercial interests than on addressing poverty. There are 9 mentions of poverty and 27 mentions of trade. I think I can stop here, but look forward to elaborating and having the conversation on what we feel are the missed opportunities with the international development strategy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karimi. I think that last point you've mentioned resonates also with the where of the international development strategy in terms of which countries and regions are prioritised here, and a shift away in terms of the key strategic partners mentioned here. We have South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, for example. There's only one actual low-income country there. There's a tilt towards Indo-Pacific. And so on, back to the Caribbean as well. So although there is mention of low-income countries here and there, it's not as strong as previously. One thing I was going to ask, partly building on Karimi's points about the lack of pro-poor focus, and maybe Stefan from an insider perspective, was there a sense of dancing around legal issues here? The 2002 International Development Act is really clear about tied aid and aid being used for the poorest. And this sails very close to the wind here. I'm not sure if any advocacy NGOs have considered making a legal challenge to this, or might do. But was that a part of the conversation internally, if you can?
I can. So actually, on both points, actually the act is not as clear as you try to suggest.
Mm-hmm.
During the times of DFID, we very clearly used a particular interpretation of it. But the fact that their judicial reviews are rare in this matter is probably to do because the act is also less precise than sometimes advocacy groups have made it sound. Mm-hmm. I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand these things fully, but it's about interpretation and practice of interpretation rather than the legal letter. So there is a certain vagueness in the act as well. Mm-hmm. I don't think there is a massive move away from the grey zone which the UK already was in since 2015 and probably was before 2010 in terms of, before 2000 in terms of the tied aid kind of things. Mm-hmm. Okay. Since 2015, that language around finding ways of doing it. There is no intention here to, I think, as far as I know, but what do I know, of going beyond it. Mm-hmm. And then same of the support of the poorest. There's all kinds of ways that this language in the act doesn't necessarily translate in you must spend on the poor directly and so on. So yeah, I don't think that's the thing. But having said that, the strategy says what it is, and counts of words have been done as we just heard. There is a relative emphasis that is shifting, and whether it's on SDGs or on poverty language, it's not that it disappears. There's where programs are in countries, there's still a strong commitment on the ground and an empowerment to actually of people doing it, to do it around the poorest. Mm-hmm. broader picture. It's a broader resource than maybe it was. The use of the resource is broader than it used to be within a different context. But can I just add to it? Of course, even then we had already, by the end of DFID, 25% of money was spent by the rest of Whitehall in other ways. So, DFID and the full budget is not easy, and the full thing is not easily comparable. Maybe what we have now is actually just a more honest statement of a trajectory that is actually much longer.
Thanks for that. So we do have some questions now from the audience. There's one I'm going to reserve from Peter till later, and I think because we're going to come on to the how. I think Isaac's question around conflicts and health crisis, I think we've been given strong indications, particularly from Melissa and Karimi, that the strategy does not represent a coherent and full enough response to those types of challenges, that it's falling short here. So I'm going to come to Florian's question instead, and this is really a broader question that you can take specifically on the question of why there's nothing here on combating illicit financial flows, which seems strange given the UK's previously prominent role in this. But so direct responses to that one, please. But also, is there anything else really obvious missing that, it's something we used to do well? There was a big social protection agenda for a while, and the UK was a leader in delivering cash transfers or encouraging countries to do that. Is there anything else obvious that we could be contributing that's gone missing here? Who wants to start? Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, well, I think it is. Essentially, the strategy says very little about governance and accountability and transparency generally. So my understanding is that earlier versions, and Stefan's told us how many there were, did have this commitment to open societies in it rather more fully, and that somehow has dropped away in the final version. And maybe that's where we would have looked for some of these commitments around monitoring illicit financial flows, combating those. So those have gone, and I think it really is a gap. I think the other gap that is missing is an explicit commitment on transparency and accountability from the FCDO itself. Because if one's to support rights and accountability and governance in other countries, there needs to be an FCDO lead on transparency. And DFID was always very, very strong on transparency, more so than the Foreign Office, actually. And yet some concerns around lack of transparency were raised in March by the National Audit Office, and they've been raised repeatedly by the International Development Committee. And I think it would have been really good to have the strategy really say something about that commitment to a fully transparent use of aid, which will be important for public confidence, as well as ensuring that we're continuing to lead on a world stage where these things are important.
Good point. I think there's the very closing sentence is a throwaway comment about it, but that's about all there is. I'm not sure if, given current political malaise in this country, this is it's made it more difficult for countries in the West in general to pontificate on issues of governance, and accountability might be part of the story here. I'm not sure, but no, it's one obvious thing that's missing. Any other comments on missing, perhaps particularly on the illicit financial flows that's been raised? Go ahead, Stefan, and then we'll move on to that.
Very, very quick on that is that, as you can see, the kind of, it's not that these issues have disappeared. If anything, I think, including in the actions in the context of Ukraine and Russia, there is a massive opening for it to be acted upon, and I'm pretty sure that there are definitely people in the organization that actually are eyeing these opportunities, because the international crime bill is gone through. There's all kinds of things that we thought were never feasible. They're now actually law, and so that they can be used. So the instrument is there. Maybe a comment on it. It reflects a little bit on what this document does, and maybe I can then sense some people's disappointment on it. It's actually as a kind of a modest, rather safe vision of development that stays away from very difficult things, and it maybe is a reflection on a sense of almost an element of a political consensus in that terms of these are core things that probably not too many people fundamentally disagree with, but we stay away from more difficult areas because And we shouldn't underestimate, in the current climate, the support for international development is not that high, not least in those places where the domestic politics is actually where the marginal seats are. And so there is maybe a bit of a risk aversion in the final versions on it that I think, I probably would have welcomed a bit more risk taking, but these are choices that are being made.
Thanks, and I think you started to answer one of the questions there from Melissa Lazelle, that the domestic political agenda is having an impact on the strategy in terms of what's being included and emphasised and what isn't. Okay, thanks for those inputs on the what. I'll come back to the other questions in the Q&A as we move forward. So we're going to discuss now about the how of the international development strategy. And Mark, can you please get us started on this? I mean, the idea says several things about the shift from multi to bilateralism, stronger role for local embassies, reduced bureaucracy, and so on. What's your impression of this and how the new look FCDO, or maybe not quite so new now, will be able to deliver on this within a 0.5 world for now at least?
Thanks, Sam. Well, I think that the first thing I'd say, and I wouldn't underestimate, is just actually having the strategy published probably really provides a bit more welcome stability. I mean, if you think about the last 2 to 3 years, mergers, ministerial changes, budget fluctuations, any kind of commitment to a more patient approach to development really just relies on a bit more institutional stability, a bit more policy stability. So I think having a document, whether anyone likes all the details of it, actually just having that document is probably a positive for implementation of development policy. A second point, just to pick up on what Stefan was saying about the capital investment and the commitment to increase capital spending. I think this is probably the most immediate implementation challenge facing FCDO. It's not entirely clear from the document as to who is going to actually be administering a lot of this increase. So it's quite likely that the likes of British Investment International, the private infrastructure development group, these kind of DFIs might see their resource allocations increase. But I don't think that's going to they can't do everything that the strategy talks about in these new investment partnerships. It makes reference, for example, to things like lending for infrastructure. And that just raises questions as to, who does that? FCDO doesn't necessarily have the capabilities to give out infrastructure loans. We don't have an established development bank like in France, Germany. So, is there thinking about the UK infrastructure bank lending overseas? Are we thinking about getting private banks to, do infrastructure lending? These are some questions that people will be wrestling with at present. A third thing that we've already sort of started talking about is the future approach to multilateral cooperation. So the strategy, we are still going to invest a lot through the multilateral system, about 1/4 of the budget. And the strategy talks a lot about working with, allies in the G7. What's a bit unclear is how, if, for example, the G7 comes up with certain political commitments about cooperating to, combat debt, combat climate, what are the actual coordination structures, the multilateral structures to deliver that? If you're suspicious of a multilateral organization with representation from so-called malign actors, if you don't want to work through the EU anymore, who is your vehicle to actually program and execute, G7 agreed development initiatives? And then perhaps a final one around the British centres of expertise. So I actually think, an acknowledgement of the importance of expertise and ideas explicitly is, quite welcome, and not just, the money, as it were. But I think a big challenge is how you align UK expertise with the demand of country governments, and particularly in poorest countries, given the nature of the UK economy. So, you know, if we think about China's offer, where, you know, China has industrial interests in infrastructure, it's good at delivering infrastructure, that's actually being demanded by a lot of very poor countries. And so there's quite a nice alignment there. Whereas if you look at historical UK economic investment through the aid budget, a lot of that is focused on banking, financial services. You know, how much does that align to the demands of the countries that are most in need? Maybe saying Kenya or, you know, Indonesia, there might be interest in some of that. But you know, perhaps less so in some of the poorest countries. And so I think that raises questions around how does the UK adapt its offer of expertise in different geographies that needs to be thought through. I'll stop there. Thanks, Sam.
Excellent, thanks for that. Some really thought-provoking stuff on how on earth this will be delivered, given how far it goes beyond the usual DFID structures for implementation. Thanks for that, Mark. Melissa, can you come to this now in terms of your sense of whether the new modalities talked about here have the capacity to deliver on this agenda? You've done a lot of work on the global aspects of this around health and climate change, and I wonder if you share the concern that Peter Taylor's, your colleague, has put in the chat here about the retreat from multilateralism and whether that's going to really help us address in a joined-up way the types of things that you and others have been working on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's quite clear that the shift to bilateralism in this strategy is about a strategy for control and prioritization, which reflects the alignment with a kind of slightly Britain first agenda around business interests and around diplomatic ties. But I think there are actually some major problems with this stance. One is that pragmatically, for the kinds of challenges that are now fortunately being named in the strategy, climate change, global health security, heading off future pandemics and so on, we know that global cooperation is vital. These are global challenges. They're not ones where any one country or any bilateral partnership can deliver alone. There need to be mechanisms not just for joint multilateral action and investment and accountability, but actually for the kind of learning and strategizing that can really only come through those relationships. So I think multilateral agencies such as those in the UN are best placed to lead on and in fact inspire these in a softer way. And I think it's quite short-sighted for the FCDO to cut support for them without a clear assessment of the impact that will have. And that's not to say that there's not room for reform in these international agencies, but actually the ability to shape those reforms is much reduced by a strong message that the UK is pulling back support from them. It should be working to help them do the job they need to do. I think there's also a kind of softer message. I mean, we've been talking quite a bit about how this strategy is also a diplomatic strategy. And yet without that international multilateral collaboration, or by sort of vocally pulling back on it, there's actually a risk that the UK is undermining these aspects of soft power, which have always been important to the global development offer and an important part of it, and arguably an even more important part of it. Now we have a merged entity that's trying to do diplomacy through development. So as Peter Taylor has put in the chat, many collaborators in the rest of the world are looking at these moves and seeing in them a self-interested, perhaps Britain first agenda, and feeling that actually collaboration is no longer wished for or wanted. And I think that is a negative for soft power. I think there is also, a particular problem where there's reduced collaboration and cooperation with other really key development actors. And it is worth talking about China. I mean, this strategy has been put forward quite explicitly as a counter-offer to what is seen as the development offer now of a malign geopolitical power in China. Now, I don't think we need to get into questions about what is going on within China to recognize that actually China as an actor on the global stage in development is incredibly important through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, through demands for infrastructural investment. That is not going to go away. We have had a history of very strong collaboration with China in development thought and action in third countries. And that's been, I mean, the repeated international development fora with China, the UK-China fora, which has gone on year after year, which is an important diplomatic space and a collaborative development space, has actually been very positive. And I think by pulling back from explicitly from China, there's a risk at best of failing to join up efforts in particular countries, because China's not going to stop investing in infrastructure in Africa, for instance, but also at worst, providing China with a determination, not just to go it alone, but perhaps actively to compete with and undermine the development efforts of those nations with whom a deep schism exists, which now increasingly seems to be the UK. So I think that's something to worry about. Finally, I have to say something about localization, because the counterpoint to this is the idea of working locally through local actors, through local governments, grassroots NGOs, local civil society with people from the perspectives of people living in poverty. And the UK has a long history of doing that very, very well. The strategy says very little about it, but it does present an opportunity in the joining up of actions through embassies within countries. And I think it's not detailed here, but if there's something to be positive about, it's around how humanitarian and development action, by being more coordinated at the country level through embassies, could create the opportunity for a genuinely integrated local offer, and that needs to go forward with the support of civil society and local actors on the ground in those countries, responding to their demands.
Thanks, Melissa. That has been a clear feature of the shift with development now within an FCO orbit, that shift towards country embassies playing a bigger role here. And it's one of the points made in the strategy is that they will have sign-off of larger amounts with shorter run bureaucracy through to business case developments, which could be positive in terms of responding to local agendas. Elsewhere, there's very little on local agendas, nothing on local content, for example, in all the investments and jobs that are supposed to be created. So I think there's mixed messages on localization. But Stefan, what do you think? As FCDO is currently structured and given the types of ideas that are outlined here, how confident are you that the right levers are being identified and developed to deliver on this strategy?
Yeah. Okay, so of course I joined the day before the merger, and of course mergers, as everybody even from outside can see, it's quite complicated, quite messy, and quite difficult. And regular announcements of staff cuts and new targets for reducing don't help with structures. They don't help. So let's put it simply that like it's again always a bit too early to tell, because structures are still evolving and we're getting there. So maybe a couple of comments, and I will pick up at the same time a little bit on what Mark and Melissa were alluding to. So maybe this first point on localization and so on, and I'm I can definitely tell you there was a very active discussion, and of course from people in the organization, development staff, they were looking for ways of how do we begin to do a bit better on that and find ways of doing it. So I'm glad that people pick up here and there a few words that have come in around that, and indeed, moving more to the country, the sign of heads of missions, language around partnerships. There's some opportunities there. Hopefully they can find ways of working around it. Again, budget structures and so on, any heads of mission that may be listening to and say, yeah, but I get the wrong kinds of money and the whole kind of thing. And it alludes to a little bit of what Mark was alluding to as well, is that, everybody likes a bit of that stability, but, there's a lot of that capital around, and people haven't quite clocked that in the sector, is that, and one of the reasons why it's there, because it's actually fiscally convenient, when you give capital There's some forms of capital that don't count to the deficit, nor count to the debt. There's other forms of capital that don't, they count to the debt, but not to the deficit. And so, you know, they look good in the figures of the Treasury. And let's say I've had quite a hard time with our colleagues at the time at HMT, asking for a policy vision around the nature of that spending rather than a fiscally convenient way of providing money. And Mark is absolutely right, is that delivering this thing, a big part is that how do you deliver all that capital and pick it up, and it's a lot of things. I will say there's a handful of people that are incredibly good at it in the organization, but the scale up of these sums of money, it's actually really quite a challenge, and we'll have to see that. So that's another part of the capability. So there's on the one hand, on the local side, a commitment, but if you then don't get the right resource for it, whether it's in people or in staff, then it's a bit hard. Then the other part is on the capital side there as well. So there's some real challenges, and, you know, hopefully the stability can come, a bit of a settlement of the organization, that actually they can start trying to do it, because it will be a huge challenge to deliver on this strategy, and there needs to be some form of settlement. I can't help it for a moment want to comment on this multilateral point one more time that Melissa is doing as well, because it's quite helpful, because I don't think if people interpret it, this is clearly a retreat from multilateralism. We have to be a little bit careful. It's again a little bit too early to tell, because I don't think it's necessarily as dramatic, you know. And again, it's driven a little bit by elements of framing. The nature of the resource is definitely a factor here. You know, the kind of issues to do with, you know, there's less money around. And actually, in the first round of cuts, it was very hard, for example, to do less money to the World Bank, because that actually is almost a legal obligation. So the fact that the next replenishment for the World Bank is quite dramatically less has a lot to do with, because earlier cuts during COVID and then during the move to 0.5 didn't allow for that to be cut. So there is a bit of an adjustment happening there. So let's not overstate it as well. But of course, there's two other frames as well. First of all, the political, you know, and it is an element of wanting to be a bit more in control. But if I can tell you one thing from the internal kitchen, if we had kept the multilateral commitments in the same way as before, we would have closed the entire bilateral program. There was just no resource left to do bilateral work. Now, I don't think that would have, and no money for NGOs or whatever, I don't think that would have been the outcome you would have welcomed either. So there was an element of having some reality there, reality check. There's a political narrative as well. But the geopolitics is actually quite an interesting thing, and that's the one to watch going forward. And I think Melissa picked that up well. There's a choice being made quite clearly that, and we've seen that during Cold War situations, is that you don't rely on multilaterals because also your enemies are in it. And so you don't really want to look at that. And that's the space to look, you know, that what you picked up, how much are we still willing to cooperate and how much is it all antagonistic? And I think there's some important choices to be made. It's early to tell. Let's say that there's a lot of different voices inside the organization and up to very high levels. And it's a bit to see. I don't think there's a retreat from it, but it may look very different because of geopolitics.
Thanks, Stefan. We're going to come to the issue for NGOs with Karimi in just a second. Just there's a question from Will Worley which touches on the discussion that you and Melissa have both hinted at around. So we've got two suggestions on the table. The strategy has what I think Ranil Dissanayake referred to as a David versus Goliath approach, that we're going to somehow outspend China on infrastructure and outbid them there, which seems a little ludicrous, versus Melissa's suggestion that actually there's some reasonable forms of development cooperation which might be possible going forward. But I think Will wants to challenge you on that, Melissa, as you know, is that politically feasible in this context?
Okay. So when I say development cooperation, I'm not sure I actually even use that term. I'm not talking about joint investments in projects necessarily. But there is a substantial history, especially over the last decade or so, of the UK and China working together to share knowledge, to learn from each other around strategies, and to work in complementary ways. And that has been sort of kind of cemented through things like the UK-China Development Forum, which was supported by DFID until quite recently, through joint learning programs and courses, and by this UK-China forum that happened yearly, which gradually has moved towards being seen as a diplomatic forum to actually discuss one of the areas where the political differences could be not completely put aside, but sidelined around in relation to joint interests, complementary interests in supporting third countries. And I think that was a very productive space, both in terms of ensuring that China's development work was well targeted, where it would often look to the experience of the UK, making sure that the UK's investments were complementary to China's and not competitively, and actually creating and enabling and keeping open a space for good diplomatic relations. And it's the loss of those things through a strategy that so explicitly pits itself as in opposition to China, now labelled as a wholly malign actor on the world stage, that I think is a problem. So it's a slightly more subtle point. I hope that covers it.
Yeah. If I could just briefly add to that, is that, you know, and look, and I think with Melissa, I was actually always very involved in this this whole cooperation with China. And, you know, look, it's tricky, you know what's going on. They hold different values on certain things. But having these lines of dialogue and cooperation, these are all tiny amounts of money that are involved in it. Yeah. It was actually quite important, and it was you know, very productive and so on. And I think there will have to be at some point some form of error correction in this whole way, because, you know, yes, you know, there are strategic interests that are totally opposite to ours, of course, with China, if you see it from a foreign policy point of view. But it doesn't mean that you close off all the forms of cooperation. Just think of climate change. We need to keep on talking to them, and there needs to be lines of communication. And I think both what's happening maybe with us, that's definitely my personal view, but actually it's same with State Department. It's flipped totally, and actually that's not that helpful. And I think for development, actually, it's really unfortunate, because it forces countries to make choices that actually, with a slightly more rational way of approaching it, wouldn't have to make it. Because I was just earlier on a conversation on Zambia. You know, we need a common framework, and we need to work together in it to also reschedule Chinese debt. We can't solve these things by just calling them out and so on. So there's so many issues. We need to have lines of communication. Even if your fundamental strategic interest is moving apart, there are still joint strategic interests as well where we can cooperate.
Thanks for clarifying. I think that is much clearer. Right. So, Karimi, I mean, what do you think this means for the role of for NGOs going forward in terms of their role in delivering on this? Civil society is name-checked a few times, but not an awful lot of detail beyond an intriguing mention of 12 NGOs that will be central to this strategy going forward. But what's your take on this?
Yes, definitely. We keep repeating that there isn't a lot of detail, isn't it? And it's in the details that we really sort of understand what all this means. Having said that, I think that the role of NGOs will continue to be one of advocacy to begin with, really looking at where this policy direction is going, and as much as possible within, you know, the context that we've already spoken of, seeking to hold the UK government to account and to engage. The aspects around, for instance, shifting power to the FCDO offices in partner countries, what might that look like for the localization agenda? To what extent, you know, the issues around or the areas around being patient, or a patient approach, I think we've suggested here that it might be related to the whole issues of partner capital, or rather the capital side of things, and patient capital. I think where it is around areas that can be worked through, and I'll give the example, I think that Mark alluded to earlier about financial inclusion, for example. excellent work or initiative by DFID and others in Kenya to look at financial inclusion, that and innovation around that, and the technology, the mobile telephony, for example, that absolutely transformed an economy, and broader than that, in regard to mobile money, and bringing in literally tens of millions of people who might otherwise not have been included in the financial sector through that technology, and what that has done for health, that has done for markets, for climate issues, for social protection. And here I'm not just talking about Kenya, but broadly in many countries around cash transfers, etc., etc. So when we look at the some of what is said around trade, just to give an example there, with the British International Investment, former CDC institution, mega infrastructure projects. Is this about trickle down? And what does that actually mean? We know that many of our countries are indebted, highly indebted. So governments in the global south, in low-income economies, not able to meet obligations around social infrastructure, for example, health, education, etc. So the issue there of, even where it might be about trade and investment or technology and innovation, who is it benefiting? How do we as NGOs engage in maybe the opportunity, if there is one, around the kind of examples I shared earlier that bring to scale transformation economically, socially. But having said that, I think, Sam, to your question, it's a difficult hill to climb here. NGOs, of course, don't only rely on the UK government funding, so funding from FCDO, the 0.7. We do have a range of funding streams, but having said that, in the past, it has been very, very important funding for us. We remember the PPAs, for example, and some of work on climate resilience, on health, on civil society strengthening, on governance, etc. That this kind of ODA that had vision, that had a long-term view, that was linked and related to the needs on the ground of communities of people living in poverty and experiencing all manner of structural inequality. That was when Britain, that was when the government was at its best. And I think the challenge for us then is, as NGOs, is how do we continue to do what we have been doing, yes, with less resource from FCDO in this case, but ensuring that our engagement with local partners is a different type that strengthens the quality of the partnership, and where there are the opportunities to engage with the international development strategy, that we optimize on that. But I think it is a lot more harder with the IDS as we have it today.
Yeah, I mean, there were, even going back to the 90s and 2000s, there were concerns about NGOs being a bit too close in some ways to aid for comfort, and that's when when there was a lot of alignment around the policy agenda. Now I suspect that is an even more difficult challenge for NGOs who are fundamentally internationalist in nature, with aligning with this particular strategy. Thanks for that, Karimi. We're going to move on in the last 20 minutes of our discussions onto questions of research and expertise and how this can shape international development futures going forward. And we've already got a couple of really good questions on this to help point us forward. So the International Development Strategy does have a focus on our global leadership in science and technology. And as Eob Gebramariam says in his question here, this is very similar to the strategy of UK Research and Innovation, which the umbrella body for our various funding councils for UK research, is linked to making UK a global superpower in science and research. So in that broader context, what do our panel think of the implications that the IDS has for research and its role in contributing to development? And if you can you comment on the two sort of concrete aspects here? We have centres of expertise, which seem to be a hybrid bringing together of consultants in implementation expertise along with a bit of research maybe, but let's see. And the only other concrete one is the Global Research Partnership, the trilateral arrangement that UK, India, and low and middle income countries have had since 2014 to fund research on what works and so on. So there's some specificity, but not a huge amount. So as a sector very interested in this question, I'll come to you first, Mark, from an ODI perspective. Perhaps what do you make of this from a research to policy perspective going forward?
Thanks, Sam. So yes, as you say, I mean, the strategy is quite light on detail on this. So, but perhaps some speculation. I mean, I suppose DFID was known for being a kind of centre of excellence in commissioning research on development and really trying to understand, getting the best possible evidence on what are some of the barriers to economic, social development, a real focus on research quality. You would imagine with the kind of shift in direction that research might be more instrumentalized, a bit more of it, almost like a philanthropic commissioned model of research, where it's, you're often, there's an interest in research if it gives the right answers. I mean, would be a kind of a sort of a somewhat pessimistic speculation on the kind of direction research commission through the aid budget might take. So, but perhaps just as the second thought, a slightly more optimistic thought, is that I do think there's potential in this kind of whole of government approach to thinking about science and technology and trying to think about the role of UK innovation that's funded beyond just the aid budget. I mean, we did see in the COVID crisis that, some of our most significant, important investment, was around vaccine development that didn't necessarily come through the aid budget. And so I think if, the potential for thinking a bit more in whole of government terms around how, for example, the Research and Innovation Fund, some of the things being set up by Patrick Vallance and others, how we think about our science and technology assets and how we can bring those to bear on development challenges and not just kind of research assets commissioned through aid. I think that could be one potential positive, but again, quite light on detail as to how that might actually come about. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Melissa, do you share that concern that there's some positive things here, but research is set to be even further instrumentalized as a result of this strategy?
Yes, and I've got a couple of other reflections as well. So I think the first thing to note is that there is more in this strategy about research than one might have expected, and that's a really good thing. And in a way, it is in a positive sense. It still is seeing the UK as a centre and a focus of thought leadership in development through expertise and through research. So that's great, and I think we didn't necessarily expect it. Secondly, it is this strategy itself is all of government and also needs to be read, as comments in the chat are pointing out, alongside other things emerging like UKRI's strategy, which has just been launched. And I think the coherence of the UK's science and technology and innovation offer across ODA funding and non-ODA funding is going to be something really important to look at. And indeed, we do have this board, the SCORE Strategic Coherence of ODA Research Board, which is keeping a watching brief on those issues. And I use my role as an independent member in that to try and help that coherence, but also emphasize certain directions which I think do get underplayed in this strategy. So yes, it's light on detail, but maybe one would expect that. But it also contains within it some hints that I do find a little bit worrying. So one of them, yes, is the potential for instrumentalization, and perhaps a pulling away from the kind of research that will actually show that something's pushing in the wrong direction. I mean, I think there is a real risk of both evaluating what works, but also keeping open that space for research which can challenge, which can avoid these kind of echo chambers, the ventriloquy of thought and solutions, and actually be a bit more critical and a bit more open, set new paradigms, open up new opportunities in a bigger way. I think the second hint I'm seeing in this strategy is very much a science and technology focus, with an emphasis on the natural sciences, the biomedical, and indeed sort of sharp end innovation technologies, whether in energy or health or whatever. Now, without denying that those are important, that is not all there is to Britain being a science superpower, and it's certainly not all there is to the kind of global science collaboration that we want to see through these funds and expertise. We absolutely need to keep the interdisciplinarity that has been a feature of UK work alive and well. That means treating the social and political and economic sciences, and indeed the arts and humanities, as equal partners, not just the kind of afterthought that tell you how to implement something and tell you about a few behavioural factors you might want to take into account. They need to be centre stage. We also need a real focus on equitable partnerships and on the kind of co-learning that has been a feature of the best of some of the things like the Global Challenges Research Fund, where local actors, civil society, non-academics, as well as research institutions in lower middle income countries are part of the creation of bodies of knowledge, which can suggest what works, but also challenge directions and open up new ones. So that's what I'm not seeing, and more to the point, I think there's a slightly worrying subtext here that is rather exclusively techie, and that's something I think we need to push back on a bit.
Yeah, there do seem to be some missing issues there around social and governance issues where DFID funding has in the past really led to very positive results, and a bit of a mixed message on the push in UKRI for multidisciplinary research, which really brings together the strengths of different areas, and that doesn't seem to be coming through as strongly here. Stefan, what are your thoughts on this? When you were working officially chief economist within DFID, you're a big, thirsty imbibers of research, and you've got a track record of putting that into practice with programming and your interactions with governments in the global south. How do you think this new approach will help to service what FCDO needs, and will it draw on the best of what development research within and beyond the UK can offer?
Yeah, so maybe a couple of things. So the first one, look, I appreciate the comments that were made actually by Melissa and Marcus, very sensible and rightly observed. So it's the first thing is really, so I don't see very much in the research part of the strategy kind of a rupture or a big change. You know, this is an evolution that's been happening, where ODA money was part of the overall research and R&D strategy of the government, spent not just by DFID in the past, but also DEFRA, DHSC and BAE, so health and business, and being spread out, and not least the last ones, you know, with their links to the UKRI and universities. it had a certain transactional nature as kind of providing resources to universities, not necessarily just primarily for the impact on development, but with really good impacts nevertheless. So there's a bit of that as well. I think it's well observed that there is an interest, but that's overall in the R&D strategy of the UK now on a bit of silver bullets type of stuff, big solutions, techie, and so on. And but again, it's not specifically on this strategy. I think that is a reasonable thing to say about, making it not anymore a research thing, but it becomes R&D. It becomes focused on the kind of innovation. And there's lots of strong defenders of that to actually say, look, solutions for climate change or for health, it's all to do with that kind of techie stuff. But maybe us more social scientists would say, well, there's probably some other things we want to keep on looking at. At the same time, I'm not as concerned at this stage that this kind of drive for high quality research that actually DFID had, that is really under threat. The structures are still very similar, with the chief scientist is actually the same person, a chief economist coming out of academia. There is a real commitment there to be very evidence-based. This is not going to be lots of money for transactional partnerships because a minister had a nice meeting with someone in Thailand and whacks of money being exchanged. So that's absolutely not. So I think in the chat there is a comment as well. Actually, this is just much more the kind of general direction. It's nothing specifically. Yeah, the gaps, because we could argue about it that you want to see this in certain ways. But as a strategy, despite the fact that there's quite a lot of language there, it's still quite vague. It's 30 pages for a strategy document. That's probably pretty reasonable. You don't like 300-page documents with a full budget. That's not what you aim to do. And I will actually comment, we do 30 pages. Chinese leaders used to say simply one line, doesn't matter whether it's white or black, as long the cat catches mice. Often that was the only instruction civil servants got. And that's a little bit how you should think about how this is used. There is enough here for those people that have to put programs in practice to say, okay, where's my hook here? Does it fit within strategy? And I think that's how you will see it doing. So this is why it's always early now to see what will it mean, because now it's actually up to lots of officials to get their programs aligned with these kind of things. And then you will see, do they push the boundaries of what is possible, or is it all very, boring, or is it certain directions get more attention than other things? And that's in the implementation. That's too early to see.
Apologies. Thanks, Stefan, for that. I just want to briefly go back to an earlier question from Julian Khan. He asked about the UK Centres of Expertise. And I wonder what people think about this as a modality through which UK research can be brought into informing FCDO strategy going forward. I mean, directly to respond to Julian's question, the strategy does identify a number of areas around financial services, economic growth, trade, technology, green cities and infrastructure, and so on, building on existing UK expertise in this area. Is this going to be something which academics and research think tanks have to engage with, or will there be enough other money for more open-ended research, do we think, going forward? Open to the panel, or any other questions on this?
I'll quickly comment. I think this is not centers of expertise. There is a ring fence for research money. The centers of expertise are not necessarily part of that. That is actually additional things. And I think it's probably seen as much more applied places. I think it's going to be really interesting, because I think some of these things will be designed now, and then hopefully academics will engage with these things, and hopefully there will be engagement of academics by FCDO on it, because they will need to be shaped, and it needs to take shape. And it's actually kind of an interesting opportunity. There should be places where these things come together, but just the way they will be commissioned, the way they will be set up, will actually play a big role in that. So it's again a bit of an open-ended question, but those people in these areas, it's definitely worth engaging and getting ideas into the public domain about how this could be done, because there is an opportunity to shape this, because I don't think it's a very clear shape at this moment. It's meant to be that interface a little bit between, knowledge and research and expertise of the UK, and also that capital portfolio. You see some of these themes, these will be themes that can absorb that capital. So kind of how do you shape green cities? How do you do sustainable infrastructure and so on? So, but that's something to be seen. I don't think it's pre-cooked.
Okay, thanks on that. Okay, we're coming to the closing section now. There's the end of a question from Peter Taylor that I'd like us to reflect on, and answers in the Q&A box as well, which is really, as a development studies community, should we be seeking to help shape and inform the implementation of the strategy? Presumably the time for setting benchmarks and querying the content of the strategy is gone, but in terms of the implementation, what role could the development studies community play in holding it to account, in informing it, and so on? Any final brief points on that before we wrap up? Anyone on the panel wants to dive in?
I'm kind of happy to quickly say this there. Look, and I totally agree with it. It's to be done. It's not because I have skin in the game. I think after version 12, I think I wasn't involved anymore. But there is actually there, and I think and it refers back to Mark's comment. This gives a certain element of stability. I think even whatever involvement I may have had in some bits, say there is actually quite a lot of still useful things to be done, and this is not. It would be, I think, very unfair to say, oh, this is like a total sellout. There is nothing there. There's actually quite a lot still very really good things to be done. And so, yeah, anyone who sees entry points to be constructive, it would actually be really interesting. I don't know how that will be shaped on FCDO side, but probably I'm pretty sure that would be open for good ideas.
Okay.
Go ahead, Melissa, and then Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is a resounding yes, really at two levels, partly because there is quite a lot that is still open and that the strategy doesn't say, and therefore opportunities to shape things in positive directions. And secondly, because I think, as been made clear, this strategy itself is a quite political document. So even if one doesn't agree with the politics, and I make no sort of suggestion on that either way, it does mean that implementation is where it's at, and there actually may be a bit of a disconnect between this document and where it's come from. I mean, there's possibly quite an interesting development studies research project to be done on the process which led to the generation of this particular strategy, if anyone wanted to embark on it. But at the same time, it almost exists at a slightly separate level from implementation, and I think it's where implementation is now at. And for those who care about development, which I take it that we all do, I think there are many roles at lots of different levels for development studies to get engaged, both in research, both in partnership, in projects, and in this whole area of providing expertise and supporting the thought leadership in development, which one would like the UK with others to continue to take.
Thanks, Melissa. We'll dwell on that within the DSA. Mark, Karimi, any closing comments?
So I'd recommend a kind of dual track strategy for engagement. I think, very important to engage on some of the ideas around capital, around expertise, around, future of multilateral cooperation, like we've discussed. I think there's also another really set of interesting questions around, what an alternative political document looks like, because it probably doesn't look like a sort of new Labour, 20 years ago political document on development. What does, in today's world, a more leftist development strategy look like? I think is also a very important intellectual exercise for a group like this.
Good points.
I would also agree that let's look at it more from an opportunity point of view. The ideas, the entry points for engagement, for alternatives. I think that they are there. And as a development studies community, as think tanks, as NGOs, etc., I think there is important space for us, or at least I hope there is important space for us. We can only, engage and see, because implementation now is key. And some of the things that we have shared that are missing in taking a very sort of narrow-minded geopolitical stance, and yet there are numerous challenges. I think it's a challenge back to us to really look at what implementation needs to be, could be, and how we engage with that and try to influence sort of policy from that perspective.
Great, many thanks. And we'll be bringing together some of these suggestions. We'll write a brief blog about this. So we'll try and capture this as well as making the recording open. So it just remains for me to flag a couple of forthcoming DSA events and then to thank our panelists. So on your screen, we have the forthcoming DSA conference, 6th to 8th of July, which is online and very reasonably priced in terms of gaining access, particularly if you're based in the Global South. So please do sign up for that conference. And in advance of it, we have 2 more advanced webinars, one of which on the 15th of June, we're going to learn from the world's largest NGO. Great panel will discuss BRAC and celebrate their 50th birthday on Wednesday the 15th. And then just over a week later, Thursday the 23rd of June, we'll reflect on the role for the university in bringing about sustainable futures. So that's a DSA in partnership with UCL organising the conference and the pre-conference webinars. So I hope to see you again, unfortunately only online, but nonetheless. So just I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panel. I've learned a huge amount about this. And I think as a community more broadly, we've really benefited from your expertise. So many thanks for sharing your time, for being so patient in the build up to this, and for being so generous with your insights. And thank you to everyone who's participated and for some great questions on this. And my apologies if we didn't get quite to all of them, but hope to see you again soon for another forthcoming DSA event. Take care.
Thanks.